Thank you, and welcoming everyone to the BYU Library Family History Center Sunday afternoon classes. As mentioned, the classes are recorded and available on the website of BYU Library Family History Center website and on the YouTube channel, both. Today we're going to talk about enhance your research with compiled genealogies, and we'll kind of get into that topic here. Might just mention that a lot of the images I've started using over the last years, 2 years actually, going in on 2 years, have been generated, and the quality of the generations is getting to be quite remarkable. I did one this last week for a presentation I was writing, and I was certain that there was no way to detect the difference between that and a photograph, no matter what the resolution. I could zoom in on the generated image to where you would get pixelation, and I was still getting individual hairs on the person's head. So it's, this is getting quite interesting here. I just kind of point out that we have a very generic term. It's called compiled genealogies, and it really refers to everything written about families, individuals that have arguably genealogical information. So there's really no cutoff if you say this book is a compiled genealogy and this book is over here is some other category. No, everything is. Anything outside of looking at original digital copies or even microfilm copies of records is compiled. And under this definition, family search family tree on the website, Ancestry's family trees, all the other those, except for those which have actual copies of the documents attached as sources, are also compiled genealogies. And let's say the accuracy, and I'll get into that a little bit later, but the accuracy is going to depend entirely upon the person who compiled it, the person who wrote the information down. They could have done that without even mentioning a source, or they may be exhaustively sourced and be as valuable as about anything you could find. So we'll just get along here. And we'll start out by showing that FamilySearch.org books under the search tab up there has something over 600,000 possible compiled genealogies. Now, these vary in type from county history, state histories, other kinds of compilations, and I'll kind of mention those differences as we go along. And you'll see it says in the headline here, books, family histories, maps, yearbooks, and more. So anything that doesn't fit directly into a category of being an original source has been put basically into the digital library. So that's the difference. Now, I think for the purposes of kind of overcoming any initial hesitations here, there's been a lot of discussion over the last many years about the accuracy of compiled genealogies, to the point where sometimes, unless you've had a lot of personal familiarity with working with these books, and we have done considerable amount of information on and talked to quite a few people who have published these books. And as a matter of fact, my wife and our general company, which called Bookmark Graphics, was in the business of publishing for almost 40 years. So we've got a lot of back history on these kinds of things. First thing is doing a search on the book catalog on Family Search. And when you do an advanced search, and there's a little button up there that you can push over to the side, it'll turn on this advanced search. And it's kind of my indication that you're going to find the information by surnames. Usually the surname is going to be the title or the subject of the book or document or whatever. You really kind of have to be a little bit imaginative if you haven't, unless you are already aware of the name of a book or record or whatever that you're looking for. You probably have to start inventing stuff and seeing if that happens to come out. And author, if you know that your grandmother published this book or donated this book material to Family Search, then looking for her name or your grandfather's name or whatever. That's the most common way to get into it. there's the little button up there in the corner, and that'll appear on the page when you go to the book section. Now, another kind of limitation that you're going to have to be facing almost from the get-go, from starting out with genealogy, is that is the standardization of names. And it's best to remain very, very familiar with the fact that you're going to find different spellings for the same person's names. And that's because name standardization didn't even start to get common until the mid 1800s. So by the 1900s, you're still getting variations. And today, I have even got members of my family who have changed their surname officially in court, and that sometimes gives some confusion. So there's just lots of different ways that we can approach these different names. And here I'm showing some examples. You can have Smith, and some people say Smith, and some say Smythe. And we have Smither, and we have Smithers, and they're just variations sometimes of the same name. And Smithson, one thing you don't realize, you do, for example, if you're doing Scandinavian research in those Scandinavian countries, they did a very obvious patronymics where the name of the child was the given name of the father. But one thing we probably aren't aware of, although we're aware of the variations, is that practically every country in the world at some point in time was using patronymic names, this meaning the son or daughter of a person. And Smithson, Robertson, Albertson, go down the whole list of sons. All those names go back to patronymic spellings, which means they're not unique in any sense of the word. Because every time a person was named Smith, the male child would be named Smith's son. Sometimes you see Smith used as an added definition when you have somebody who was a blacksmith. The smith meant they worked, pounding out knives and horseshoes and all those things. Okay. And here is just kind of a leg up on it. This is figuring out where you're going to start looking. And if your people settled in a specific geographic area and were among the first settlers, or even were somewhat prominent. Now, prominent, it changes from place to place. I mean, you could be the mayor of New York City, and you probably would be considered to be more prominent than the mayor of New Trioso, Arizona. And yeah, because just because of the vast difference of the places. New Trioso is on the eastern part of Arizona, and it has about 300 people. So it's quite small. Now, the value of these books, these county histories, you cannot understate the value of having a history of a county. And that might be the case because they've actually put all the names of the pioneer families in there, and you can begin to separate people out. And if you find your ancestor's name in there, you may very well have the first indication that there will be other records. So you would be starting to look for all the area or place related records like land and property records and probate records and tax records and all that long list of types of records that you would find. Even if the information in the county record, county history, or in the individual name books or surname books are slightly not greatly accurate, that may still give you a very interesting way to get into it and know to start out with finding out who these people were and perhaps even how they were related to others in the community. One thing to bear in mind with all of this is that many of the books, particularly, or other documents that show up in the book section of Family Search, and it, by the way, is no limit on that. Ancestry has a huge collection of books. Each of the large websites has some access to books, and we have other ways that I'll get into with WorldCat and archive.org and other huge libraries, Library of Congress, National Archives, all these different places around the country, the hundreds of different archives and museums and libraries that there are all going to have at least some of these books. We were in Keokuk, Iowa at one point in time, which is across the river from Hancock County, Illinois. And we're in the public library, just the public library, the usual library in the town. And they had a whole section of a bookcase section with genealogy books and records, and some of which, granted, we have relatives in that area, but have never seen these things. There just were not things that we were familiar with at all. So you never know. And having spent time looking for things by traveling to the individual city and county libraries all over the state of Arizona, I also am familiar with that process. Now, this is a book. It's George Jarvis and Joseph George DeFreeze, Genealogy. And the reason why I'm going to use it, because I use it because as I was growing up, I was familiar with this book in our home that had been published before around the time I was born. And interesting thing for people and their families is when they find one of these books to find out that they're listed there, that your parents may have had you as a child, and when they were compiling this book, you ended up being listed as a member of that family. So that's kind of the surprising thing. Now, the one point that needs to be understood is that when we're talking about compiled genealogies, that's whether they're books or other kinds of records, are secondary sources, meaning they received the information from somebody who told them about the event in somebody's life, or somebody had looked at a document before and then related what was in the document, or simply didn't know and made it up. So it's really kind of hard to differentiate that line between a primary and a secondary document. Census records, for example, we consider them often considered to be primary records that were created at or near the time that the people were who supplied the information. But in reality, it depended on who was the informant, who was the person who provided the information to the census taker or enumerator. The reason why I put this other brief history of Joseph City screenshot here is because even the brief history of a town, which is very small as town goes, and people say, well, where's Joseph City? And I say it's halfway between Holbrook and Winslow. Well, that doesn't tell much. It's on the freeway that goes across Arizona at the north and goes through Flagstaff. All those places are very familiar only if you're familiar with Arizona. But if you look up Joseph City on a map, you'll find it, and you'll see that this is the surname index. Now, when was it published? What was the occasion for the history? All of that kind of determines who's going to show up and be on this particular map. But if you look at the information on this map, you see a number of pages for a Bushman family, and the Bushman family and the Tanner family lived very close to each other and were friends since the founding of Joseph City as a different town. It changed three names: Allen's Camp, St. Joseph, and then Joseph City. And as a matter of how things work in genealogy, I serve with two Bushman brothers who are related to me through marriage in a sense, because the Tanners married into Bushmen, or the Bushmen married into Tanners, whichever one you want to look at that. So as I mentioned, I grew up with several of these books in my father's extensive library. And when you have a book like that and it's sitting there and you look at it and you see the names and everything, and you want to see if you're in there and you find you're listed in there, and then you start thinking, well, then who's this person that I know? This is my grandmother Overson. How am I related to her? And you can find that out in these kinds of books. So it gives you kind of a window into your family relationships. And my father's bookcase, long gone. In fact, the house that we were different houses that we lived in. So there were different bookcases. And but after I left, and after in later times, after we'd my parents were getting quite old, they sold that house, the last house to the, well, they had two more moves, but all the books were, it was an issue with all the books. And eventually, when they passed away, both of them, the books became one of the biggest, let's call it, problems with getting rid of the books. And eventually, what we did was call up somebody who wanted all the books and just said, you can have them if you want to come and pick them up. And then they would say, well, we have a pickup fee of, and we went, oh goodness, we even have to pay to get rid of these books. So, but any of the good books, any of the genealogy books and all that were saved out of that. Oh, by the way, this is a generated image. It's not my bookcase. It's not my father's bookcase. This is one like this. Although the ones that I'm talking about are just about this big or bigger. So now let's go back to the George Jarvis and Joseph George DeFreeze genealogy. This was made by my great grandmother, Margaret Godfrey Jarvis Overson. And the reason why I came back to this, so you'll understand sort of the scope here. This book is 710 pages long, and it has hundreds of photographs and pages, all of this pages of individual family histories of each of the families. Now, from the strictly genealogical standpoint, as we dig into a book like this, we may find a lot of discrepancies. We may find that the grandmother did not include a story that we've heard, and or may have changed the story enough that it wasn't as objectionable as it was when we started, as to people getting arrested and divorces and people having other kinds of issues. So we take these on the basis of what they're like, what the face is like, where we, what we're seeing, what we're getting here. But we realize that we go back to the comment I made about secondary, is that we'd like to see the documents that support this. Now, in this case, Grandma Overson wrote this book based on her firsthand talking to and writing letters back and forth to family members. And so a lot of the information is accurate. But she also, for example, here wrote in the book that she could not go back any further than Joseph George DeFreeze because there just were no records. Well, now we're a lot, many, many years from the date when this book was written and when, many years since Graham Overson passed away. Today we have DeFreeze records going back into the 1600s, first-hand, what you would call first level standard records. And so this DeFreeze family turns out to be one of the better documented families around. And it's been a great help in doing descendancy research also. This is another couple of pages from the George Jarvis book and the Overson book. This book, as do many of them, have a lot of photographs or some photographs. And here's a family group. I have no idea who these people are. Only because they're here in the book that I would have known who they were. And they probably would show up as relatives around me sometime if I were at a conference and one of them happened to be there. And what I'm illustrating here is that these books have a lot of genealogical information and value. They just have to, every time you say that, I have to qualify it by saying, yes, but, and the yes, but is do your genealogy research. Go out and make sure you have all of the documents that pertain to these people. This is a 1954 photograph, and I would guess that everybody in that picture is going to be in the 1950 census. Perhaps if there's a baby that they're not, there's one or two babies in there, and they may not show up in the 1950 U.S. Census, but everybody else is going to be in the census record, and you're going to be able to find these people very quickly. And if you're working in the family search family tree, you can show your relationship and know how you're related to all of these people in the photo. And the index at the back is very helpful. I've used it many, many, many times and coming back to get information and establish how I am possibly related to someone that I turn out to either meet and talk to or are involved in doing research. Now we can go back a little further. This is a book published in 1905 by someone named the Reverend George C. Tanner, DD, whatever. I think he was a dentist or something like that. But anyway, he was in Faribault, Minnesota, and wrote the entire book about William Tanner in Rhode Island. He did spend time in Rhode Island doing the research, but the only problem is that we have here, starting out about William Tanner, who lived in, arguably was born in the 1600s and lived into the 1700s, and has been what we would call a revolving door ancestor since he's been in family search. And that is that there are literally hundreds into the thousands of opinions about who he was, who he married, and who are his family. And so this little statement here, it appears that William Tanner first married first a daughter of Henry Tibbets, second Mary Babcock, daughter of Joe Babcock and Westerly, third Elizabeth Cottrell, to the first we assign William of North Kingston, the second Benjamin, Thomas, John Avison, married to the third, and remaining children. And it says the genealogy of William Tanner only of North Kingston, Rhode Island. It will be given in the following pages. I can say from my own personal experience that this statement has caused more bad genealogy than probably any other statement I've ever read. The one problem here that totally ignored by this George C. Tanner was the fact that there are multiple people. I have found records that show that there are at least 10 different people during the time period named William Tanner in Rhode Island. And so when you start jumping about between Kingston and North Kingston, or North Kingstown and South Kingstown, and into the other parts of Rhode Island, which, by the way, is a very small state, and the population was very much less back then than it is here today. And to have that many different people with the same name has created a tremendous amount of confusion. And it's very, very possible that someone named William Tanner did marry Mary Babcock and did marry Elizabeth Cottrell and did marry Tibbets. But that probably is, it's very likely that those are three different people. And the only thing that I can see which is now starting to unravel all of this mystery and make it easier to figure out, is the newly development full text search using AI and family search. And the records that are starting to pop up in this full text search are giving us probate and document and deed records. And the explanation of the relationships and the identities of these people is starting to become easier to determine. So eventually we may have this all figured out, but as it is now, it's just we have entries in the family search family tree for a person named William Tanner that has all three or four wives listed, plus dozens of children that probably are not his children or anyone are not even perhaps related. So that's kind of the extreme story. And we have to be careful and do our research in a very systematic and careful way in order for it to make sense and be useful. So when you find a compiled genealogy, whatever form, to consider all of these things. First of all, the provenance. Provenance is, where did the book come from? In the case of the William Tanner book, we know about the Reverend George Tanner, and we can find his history, which is published right there in the book, as a matter of fact. And that'll give us some idea about when and where this came out and what kind of research was possibly available to him at the time. Secondly, is consistency with other sources. So by the time we get through analyzing all of this with the new information that's coming out in deeds and probates and other documents that are becoming more transparent based on full text search, then we can begin to establish what is the most consistent situation here. And then are they supported by source citations? George was good at stating he got where he got some of the information, and there's the standard types things that we've all had availability for in Rhode Island, and are mostly all of them are now part of FamilySearch.org's website. So it's not been a big deal. I knew that the records were there. They were on microfilm when I was starting to do this research, and I spent many, many, many days reading entire microfilm files of town histories and the information that was contained in all of these records. And now, of course, it's getting much simpler, and so it's becoming more doable, and we may actually unravel it. Historicity means does it make sense in the history? I mean, you'll find all sorts of problems with historicity. You're going to find people who arrived in places long before they ever existed. And you'll find people who fought in wars that never even had a chance to do that. And so it's got to make sense. And that's the next one. Just looking at it and says, does this really make sense? And maybe that's a yes, and maybe that's a no. But when you start to tie all the people together and do the actual research, I'm not going to say you're going to solve the mystery because it could just make it even more difficult to solve. The more information you get, it may just give you more inconsistencies and more stuff that doesn't make sense. And you need to be careful. It's not one of the common myths. Some of the lines that I've traced back in my days get back to the three men left England in whatever year, 1650, and one settled north, one settled in Massachusetts, and one went south to Rhode Island, to North Carolina or someplace. Well, that's just a common myth. That doesn't mean that there weren't families where three sons or three men came together that related, but it does pop up very, very common. The answer is they did not have the source records that would let them see that the person in Massachusetts was not the same as the person in South Carolina, not the same family, and that they just had the same surname did not mean that they were related. So this is another reason. And the ultimate rule here is that compiled genealogy, and that includes anything that's in the family search family tree, remember, is only as good as its sources. So if you don't have sources, the information, in my opinion, is simple. It's valueless. It doesn't exist. The people don't exist. So as you go back, clicking back in your family tree on Family Search, and you start seeing people coming up with a name and about birth date, and there's no sources cited, you have just departed reality and have begun living in a myth, in the mythological area. Okay, so here's some books examples that contain genealogical information. I'm not saying they're correct. I'm not saying that they are better than any other source or anything else, but they're just examples of what kinds of things could be. So you could begin your search with surnames. And unfortunately, some people stick with surnames and seem to assume that everybody with that surname was related to them. And I can assure you that people who have the surname Morgan, which is extremely common in Wales and even in England, are not all related. And so you cannot start with this book and start thinking, well, then this is my family that lived in Australia. I have three family lines that came through Australia: the Parkinsons, the Bryans, and the Stapleys. And I also have another family of the DeFreeze line. My great great grandfather actually was in Australia when he comes into the history and ended up marrying and coming to the United States. And one other thing that's interesting to do when you are in a family history catalog, and you may be doing this also with some of the other big book websites like Google Books and archive.org and other books and even WorldCat, you should be able to just go down and think about possible people who possibly could be related. Now, I'm telling you this because when I did this recently, I discovered some tremendously valuable information that I had no idea existed. And it's been something that I've been working with now for many, many years, 40 years, 43 years to be exact. And so that's why I think it's important. This is another one. The books there on the FamilySearch.org website are PDF files and they're fully searchable. So you can go in there and start searching for names. But then again, even if you're doing that, you have to make sure that what you're looking at is somebody that doesn't just have the same name as your ancestor and that they really are related, that all of the locations regarding this person, all of the places where things occurred, are consistent with somebody that you've already documented, and that there's some kind of documentation, in which case all you have is some names to start working with to do some research on the online sources and others. Now, on the book section, you might say, well, how do I jump to a different location in the book? And it took me a few minutes to figure this out. And that is, you can look at it in a grid like this, and you can keep shrinking the grid down so you can even jump to the end of the book. But this way it gives you a way to jump around inside the material that's there on the book selection in FamilySearch.org. Now, the question might be, why am I picking on FamilySearch.org and saying that it has this marvelous book section? That's because it does. And some of the stuff, as I've mentioned, are unique. And Family Search has those books, and they're the only place that book can be found. This is an example of a book that has some good references. It's telling you that they have records which came from the Church of the Reformed and the Lutheran congregations in Nazareth Township in Northampton County. This particular record here shows the baptismal dates. And so you could go back and find and it even has the estate, and it tells the person who administered the estate, and it was in Northampton County, Pennsylvania, and then in Easton, Pennsylvania. And what you do is you begin to look up initially. The absolute first thing that you would do in this case is to go and look at all the places. Open up Google Maps and start putting in all the places and doing your distances too. So if you've got a place named Easton, Pennsylvania, and you come down here to some other places that are mentioned in here in Nazareth Township, then you want to be able to say, how far is it from Easton to New Hampshire to Nazareth Township? Did this person actually tie these people together, or did you just find somebody with the same name and assume that it was correct? So those are the kinds of things that you would start out looking at. In this case, also, you run into a very, let's call it a serious problem for doing good research, and that is you run into the copyright issue. Now, Family Search is not just fairly, they're extremely aware of copyright issues unless they have a clear release of the right by someone who could actually own the copyright or had the last possession of the book or whatever, and they can say make it public, then it's going to end up copyright protected. If it's copyright protected, you're not going to have access to the book. It's just going to come up and says the book's copyright, can't do it. And in this case, what you're looking for are books that give you the access level, and that's public, and a public access level means the book is no longer copied. It's in the public domain, and that anybody can read it and copy it and use the information in it without worrying about whether the actual owner. So this one also, the publisher is digital and it's Family Search, and the owner's institution is Family Search. The page count's 163, and right up at the beginning in this long list on the right-hand side, it says access level public. So this is someone who compiled and edited this book and signed the form to Family Search saying, oh, we don't care, go ahead and look at it. And this is what I urge people who are coming to me for help or coming to Anne for help, my wife, to get their books published. The answer to me, I always give them and say, now, I know you love this book and I know you've spent your whole life writing it, but the one thing that's only going to make it useful is if you give up the copyright. And they'll say, well, no, I have 50 copies of this book at home, and until I sell them, I'm not going to get my money back. And my answer is, that's not a really good idea. That gets me in a whole nother set of instructions, which, by the way, include don't think that you're going to be able to get your relatives to pay you a bunch of money to publish the book. It might work, it might not. My father was one of those people who paid a bunch of money to people to help them get their books, and I have still got about 5 boxes of his books sitting around in my basement. So here we have some information, and once again, looking at it, we can see that it's public. Now, what about this book? This book is called John Tanner and His Family, and it was published around 1940s, and then it was microfilmed clear back in 1993. And it's actually George S. Tanner. It's the same book that was updated. This is updated book of the book that came back and was clearly in public domain because it was 1905, and now we're into 1930s with the copyright. So this is what comes up, basically telling it you can't do anything with it. You have only a limited permission. Now, what happens if you go to the library in Salt Lake? Well, at one point they were taking all the books out of the library. Now they're putting all the books back in the library. And this one might be sitting on the shelf. And if it is, you can certainly open it up and get all the information out of the book. But that's the problem. Now, the other part of it is the next step here. So here's my counsel. If you own the copyright, you can release the copyrights of the items in the public domain. There is absolutely no reason why this book is still under copyright and has a claim of copyright. There's no more books. Copies of this are very difficult to find, and it's been digitized now. It was microfilmed in 93. It's been digitized now for probably going on how many years ago? I can't remember the exact, but it's been quite a number of years that all of the records in Family Search who were on microfilm were completely digitized. Here's the best thing you can do. Let's say you get this book right here and you get down and it says access level protected. So what's the first thing I would do? The first thing I would do is say, okay, I don't believe you because I can't imagine this book. It doesn't tell me when it was published, but it's been in the library for a while. And now let's go out and see if we can find it someplace else. And so we're going to start to look. So let's now look at this book. The book I've started with, The Descendants of John Tanner. This one published by the Tanner Family Association. I did a quick search on the Internet Archive, which is archive.org. Now, why is that helpful? Well, archive.org has right now 45 million fully digitized, fully searchable, page by page, word by word books, which right now is the largest collection of such books in the world. It's far greater than the number of books digitized and available from the Library of Congress or any other library. This is the largest library you can find. So very quickly, I pull up this book. Here it is. And this is another part of this published book. And this one has the same information as the other books. The accumulation of these books did not add any more information. It just basically got a new publication of it. And one thing to mention, of course, with the Internet Archive is if it's in the public domain or if it's here and not restricted for some reason, in 1923, put this book in the public domain because that's been some time since it's the 75 years period that we worry about. And today, it's like I say, it's in the 1930s that these books are beginning to become in the public domain. So this one's clearly in the public domain and it can be used. You would also look for books in WorldCat. This is WorldCat, WRLDCAT.org, and it's the catalog of catalogs. There are billions and billions of records on this particular website. It's the basis for most of the larger libraries in the world right now. So if you're looking here, and you can look here, and it says it found a copy in 2 libraries, and it listed the places, and the one is Provo and the Family Search Library and Salt Lake City, and the other one is in you're showing a library near Provo where that is available. So this is going to show you if you can where you might be able to find the book without traveling to Family Search. But as I mentioned earlier, there could very well be a fairly substantial number of books that are the only book in existence is there in the library. So in this case, yes, you'd have to go to the library in Salt Lake City to see this book. Or if you've got any connections, you might be able to have a family member go to the library. So kind of going back to kind of reinforce this issue of the libraries. This is the Internet Archive. And the Internet Archive, as I mentioned, have about 45 million books completely searchable. And so here's some additional books, and you may be able to find the books that have additional information on the same group of people, not just the Butters, Spaldings, and Tanners and Littley. You've got others. But this also indicates even more than looking it up in the catalog on Family Search, and that is that this book that originally we were looking for was probably the only copy of that book that's available. But you might find other helpful information here. And here was the number when I did this presentation, when I did this in about the couple of last few weeks. And that's the total number of books, ebooks and texts that are on the Internet Archive website, 45.172. And that number is larger just from the books, and they have all the other things, videos and audios and software and images, and billions of pages of the Internet Archive, which is what it is, an archive of of what's on the Internet. And it passed the Library of Congress quite a while ago. Now, we can get into the issue of history, state, county, and local levels, and they, as I mentioned previously, have and could have information about individuals and families. It may also end up, your ancestor was there, and I'm not going to make any names, but I find, yes, I knew my ancestors lived there in that town forever. Why aren't they mentioned in the book? The answer may be simple. The people that provided the funds to do the history are the ones that show up in the book, and the ones that didn't have any money, did not go along with the publication, don't show up in the book. Just what happens, and that may be the case. But here's an idea of the kind of a history that's in this one book from Grayson County. And it's very detailed, and the number of names in it are quite extensive, and so it would be some valuable, and at least would give you a lot of different places to look for the original source records. Sometimes these books are descendancy books, meaning they go back to a remote ancestor and they try to list all of the descendants of that ancestor. Those are the books that I had from my father's collection and the ones that I would look at when I was young, because that kind of told me how I was related to all these people going back to this original ancestor. Of course, that ignores, in a lot of cases, ignores the entire female lines if it's the surname ancestor, and it may also not be accurate It just maybe some of it, the original part, the oldest part of it, may like the Tanner book was not active. So the surname books are a little bit more expansive than just the descendants. They usually focus just on people with that surname. So it ignores kind of everybody that doesn't have the surname in American, in the England and the United States and English speaking countries of the world. That means the women's lines don't show up. This is probably one of the more interesting things that's happened to us, to me, and through me to the family, is that when I was looking for to do this presentation, I was kind of going through from the original book, the Jarvis book written by my great grandmother. And I find this huge gold mine of photos of book. It's a book of photos published. And the absolutely greatest thing about it is there's a list of all the people in the photos. They have, if you look really closely, every one of the photos has a little number on it. And you look over here and it tells where they were and who they were. And that gives you, let me say, my great grandmother took most of these pictures herself. And she was a professional photographer, starting through her father, who was my great great grandfather, was the photographer in Eastern Arizona. And then she inherited that from him. And between around 19, from 1918, 1915 up to 1940, she probably took pictures of every person in that entire town. It's 173 pages of everybody in this town, St. John's Apache, Arizona, up to 1959, including me. There I am. I am the cross-looking baby in that picture. And those are my parents when they were about the age that they would have had me as the first baby. You won't ever know what's hiding in the books if you don't look. You're going to sit there and say, well, nobody in my family ever wrote a book about my family. Well, okay, but how do you know that? Have you ever looked? Have you gone to the Internet Archive? Have you gone to WorldCat? Have you looked at the library catalog and the Family Search Library to see if anything's in there? So those are just kind of the things that you need to be aware of, and that this is certainly a very productive area. Okay, well, thanks for watching.